Hello, this lecture covers Chapter 10 in your textbook, Quantitative Methods. Within this lecture, we're going to talk about the major methods that political scientists use in order to study quantitative data. The three major methods of studying quantitative data would be content analysis, surveys, and statistical analysis. In this chapter, we're just going to discuss content analysis and surveys because statistical analysis is going to deserve a chapter of its own. So as I said, there are three major methods: content analysis, surveys, and statistical analysis. In addition to talking about these, we're going to also talk about issues surrounding data management and data collection. So let's start by talking about what content analysis actually is. Content analysis is a systematic approach by which records are transformed into quantitative data. This means that we can start with documents that are words, phrases, and text, normally considered to be qualitative data, and we can transform those things so that we can then turn them into a quantitative measure that we can use to analyze. We use like counts so that we can use statistical analysis to analyze those counts and look at differences there. So in order to get a better understanding of what content analysis is, we're going to use an example to go through. And what's more pressing in the world right now than the pandemic of COVID-19 coronavirus? So let's start with an example research question that we can use to go through and understand content analysis. Let's make our research question: how has media coverage influenced the federal response to COVID-19? Now, there are three major steps in content analysis, and the first step will be choosing your materials. So this is deciding what you deem to be the most appropriate source of information to use to address your research question, and all of that is going to depend upon your research question, the topic, the theory surrounding the relationship between the variables you're interested in, what already exists in research, and existing measures. So let me give you some examples of some sources or some materials you can choose from if you're interested in using content analysis. That could be newspapers, magazines, speech, social media posts, campaign material, all of those different things. You can use those to pull from to use for your content analysis. And those materials together create what's called a sampling frame. Now, if you remember earlier in the semester, we talked about a sampling frame. And the sampling frame is the population from which you select your sample from. Ideally, it will be the same thing as the total population, but that's not always the case. So this is the pool from which you pull your sample that you're going to use in your study. Now, for our example, we know that we're interested in media coverage, so we need to select from the sampling frame of media coverage outlets so that we can understand the relationship between the two variables we're interested in: media coverage and federal responses. So what will we use as our sampling frame? I'm thinking we should use two popular political news outlets that cover these two issues. And automatically the first two that come to mind to me would be CNN and Fox News. So we'll use those two coverage broadcast networks as our source of materials in order to understand the relationship between those two variables. So our sampling frame would be the total population. That would be all of the news and media outlets that are covering COVID-19, but we want to make our actual sample those two, CNN and Fox News. The second step in content analysis is to create a coding scheme. Now, the coding scheme, that is the categories that we use for our content. And it corresponds between the units and the categories that we use. It is the defining of the recording units or coding units. So put simply, it's deciding how you're going to break down the information and group the information together. Will you make categories of single words? Are you going to make categories of phrases, paragraphs, or use the entire body to use that as a category that you would use to determine the relationship between the two things? So if we were using something like a newspaper, we may say that we want to code by words. So we go through and we look at each individual word and decide where we want to place that word, which category we want to place it in. Or we could say we're going to use sentences. We look through each sentence and decide whether the sentence should fall in category A or if it should fall in category B. Or we can say we can use the entire newspaper document, whether or not this newspaper document will fall into category A or if it will fall into category B. This is something that is up to the researcher to decide which level they want to measure at. And it's based largely in trial and error because you're trying to decide what is the most appropriate level to measure from. There are strengths and weaknesses with both approach with all of the different approaches. So first, if you go by the words, then you're going to get very precise information and you're going to end up with a lot of different data points. Whereas you may end up with so much information using that method that you can't really explain a lot. But if you use it as a whole, let's say you're using entire newspapers and just putting them in a category, then you may lose valuable information that's found in like the small nuances in the sentences, the phrases, and the paragraphs. But it's up to you as a researcher to decide which level you want to use to code from or to code at. Do you want to code from the word, from the sentence, from the paragraph, the whole document as a whole? Or thinking back to our example, we decide we want to use the news outlets of CNN and Fox News. Do we want to take each program that appears on each of the station and code them in category A or category B? And we'll talk about the categories in the third step. Or do we want to go through and transcribe each individual broadcast and go through sentence by sentence or word by word and decide which category we want to put that information in? Those are all things for us to consider in developing our coding scheme. And the third step would be the actual coding of the units. And in the third step of coding the units, this is when you choose the categories to measure. That's the term we use when we're talking about how we're going to group them. You know, early on the last slide, I talked about category A and category B. This is the point in the process where you actually assign names and values to these different categories. This is when the researcher goes through and identifies keywords that they would use to define these categories by. You have to make these judgments and decide what these categories would consist of. So I used some examples on the other side of the slide of some considerations you can make. Now, going back to our example of using CNN and Fox News, we could have two categories and say they're having positive news coverage of positive news coverage of COVID-19, saying that things are getting better and reporting about people recovering, or they have negative coverage and they're talking about things are constantly getting worse and they're talking about people dying and death rates. Or we could have another coding scheme in the midst of all of this, one about international versus domestic coverage. What we see on Fox News and CNN, are they mainly focusing on what's going on in Italy and Wuhan and all of those different places? Or are they focusing on what's going on in the individual states? And then we'll code that segment based upon that if that's what we decide to do. This segment is international, so that goes into the international pile. This segment over there at CNN is domestic, so it goes into the domestic pile. Or another way we could code is by what the segment is actually about. Is it a segment that focuses on giving us just the raw facts of what's going on in the world? Or is it a segment more so of a call to action, a piece where they're demanding something happens from either the federal government or they're demanding something happens from a particular political actor, or is it just a reporting of the facts? So we can use those as some examples of some coding schemes that we could develop. But it's up to you to decide what those things are. Sometimes we can develop them independently as a researcher and go through and decide them, or we can use software in many cases where we can put all of our information in the different groups that we grouped everything into, and then the software that will decide we'll decide the best codes to use based on the information that's inputted into the system. So it is all a matter of decision making. You have like wins and losses from both ways of doing so. You may get more efficiency by using software, but there is also a possibility, because it's a computer, that there will be error if you make any sort of human error before it goes into the system, right? So let's say maybe you transpose a word or a letter in something. Because it is a computer and it can't understand that that was just a transposition, it was just a minor misspelling, it may code all of those things as being unimportant and leave them all out of the process. So there are like strengths and weaknesses to using both approaches. But in order to, when we're going through the whole content analysis process, we want to make sure that we pay a special attention to reliability and validity. And one way to raise the reliability of our coding scheme is to not code independently, is to have another coder come alongside and go through and code the material to make sure that you guys are coding similarly. And that's one of the reasons why people want to use coding software, because that is considered to be a measure that improves the reliability of your coding scheme. So that's an example of what coding looks like for content analysis. You go through, you select your source. That's the first thing you do that you're going to use as your sampling frame, and then you select your sample from there of the things that you want to use for your analysis. Once you select the things, you decide at what level you want to analyze from. Could it be word, phrase, paragraph, or the entire unit? And then the next thing you have to do is go through the process of actually coding them and figuring out what those different categories are going to be, and making sure that you're being as reliable as possible in the way that you code there. So now that we've talked about content analysis, the next thing we want to talk about is surveys. So what is a survey? Simply, a survey is a series of questions answered by a respondent. It's something that we use in order to measure the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of the people that we're asking these questions to. I'm pretty sure that all of us have had some sort of experience with surveys, whether it be something like SurveyMonkey, or we participated in actual studies where we had to complete surveys, or it could be something as simple as playing one of those games on like social media. You see them all the time on like Facebook, where it's like, which Disney character are you, and ask you a bunch of questions. That would still be a survey. So surveys are something we're really familiar with and we see all the time. Surveys can be existing surveys that have databases of collected information from participants already. Or you can create your own survey and collect your own data. This is something that's a little bit more challenging than using an existing one, but it depends on your research question. If data doesn't already exist for the thing that you're interested in, then you may have to go through and collect your own data, and that's something that I had to do personally. And it takes a lot of effort, but it does provide a wealth of information. So the next thing that you need to consider with surveys is that it can be challenging to get a truly representative sample when using survey data, because a lot of times people don't want to complete surveys. A lot of people actually hate completing surveys. So you may have people who are in your study who happen to be the rare few that enjoy participating in surveys and enjoy filling out documents. But then it's not as representative because there is a bias leaning towards those people. Another thing to consider is that all people don't do really well with reading documents. Something that your book doesn't talk about in detail. It's harder to give surveys to populations that are less educated because they don't want to participate in those things for obvious reasons if they're illiterate. And that becomes an issue in certain cases. So just make sure that when you're dealing with an existing survey, something collected by somebody already, that you check the reliability and the validity of that data. When you use secondhand research or secondary data, you have to remember that certain things are out of your control, and you have to rely on somebody else's ability to keep good records for your study and using their data. So that's something definitely to consider there and to remember there. There are a number of sources that you can get existing data from that you may not be familiar with, or you may be familiar with. I'll name just a few of them that you may be familiar with and you may want to use for your own study. First is the GSS, the General Social Survey. Anybody can get access to that. If you type in GSS survey, you're able to pull that up, and it's a survey that's given to like the American people. It's nothing like very specific to a specific group or anything like that. It's a very general and broad survey that's given to the American people, and it has lots of questions that may be of interest to you depending on your survey's design. Another site that you could use would be ICPSR, which stands for the Consortium of Social Research. They have lots of research done out of the University of Michigan. And then you could also use Roper for surveying, and that's out of Cornell University. There's also the Bureau of Labor Statistics that you can use as a source. It's not so much a survey, but it is a data source that you may find beneficial. So when you have to go through and create your own survey, there are a couple of different things that you have to consider when there's a trade-off. When you're using an existing survey, there are a lot of things and a lot of steps that you don't have to go through and consider because it's already been done for you. But when you decide to use and create your own survey, there are a number of things that you need to consider there. And we'll talk about those in detail. One of your first considerations should be the questionnaire design and some of the issues that come with the questionnaire design. So the questionnaire design is basically the layout of the survey. You want to make sure that when you're developing a survey, that the survey is structured in a way to where it's attractive and it's easy to complete. Nobody wants to do a survey where it looks like it's completely bombarded with words from beginning to end in 8-point font, with 0.05 margins, and you seem like you're overwhelmed by that. Excuse me. You seem like you're overwhelmed by that. And you also want a survey that's easy to follow and that's visually pleasing to the eye. You don't want to do a survey to where you can't figure out where exactly to place your answers or how to get to the next question. All of those things have an impact on your response rate. The ability for people to actually start your survey and finish it. And that's something very important in survey research, is making sure that you have people not only start your survey but finish it. So you want to make sure that your survey is designed in a way to where it's the most appealing to the eye so that you can get proper completion from there. And also, having a well-designed survey makes it easier for you to transfer the data to the computer, because it's easier for you if it's structured in a very clean and clear way to transfer what's done on paper or some other source into your data set that you're going to use for analysis. Something you need to consider when designing your survey questions is definitely the wording for the questions. You want to make sure that you ask good questions, because if you ask good questions, then you'll get good information from your respondents. If you ask bad questions, then you'll get misleading information back from your respondents. And the crazy thing about this is that nobody ever thinks that they ask bad questions, because the way that you present the question when you first develop it is usually the way that makes sense to you. But you have to remember that what makes sense to you may not make sense to every other person. So when you structure those questions, it's good to get somebody else to review them and to go through the process of piloting your questions to make sure there aren't any unknown issues. Because we may use words within our discipline that are like very common and well known, but they may not make sense to somebody on the outside looking in. When you're developing your survey questions, you need to make sure that you ask questions that are easy to understand as well as being easy to answer. You want to make sure that you ask questions and you use simple language and common words that's appropriate for the population that you're studying. And that doesn't mean that you have to use one syllable words for every question if that's not applicable to the population. If you're surveying a group of medical students who are in med school preparing to be doctors, it's okay to put medical terminology in the question if that's something that's of interest for your study of medical students, because they should know what those words mean. But if you're doing a study of sixth graders, it's probably not great to use big 3 and 4 syllable words, because they may not know what you mean by those things. Or if you're speaking to the elderly, that may also be a concern as far as them understanding what those things mean. So I say all of that to say that you need to make sure that you use simple and clear language for your population so that they can understand what you're asking, because if they understand what you ask, then they'll probably give you a better response to the question that you're asking. Other things to consider when designing your survey questions is that you want to make sure you don't design questions that are difficult to respond to. The first major issue that happens in designing questions for a survey is that people have a tendency to develop double-barreled questions without realizing it. So what's a double-barreled question? Well, if there are any hunters that are listening to the lecture, you know that a double-barrel shotgun is a gun that has 2 barrels on the end and that shoots out 2 bullets at one time, or 2 shells at one time. That's the same thing that we do with some research, some survey questions. We ask two questions at one time. I'll give you an example to kind of make this a little bit clearer. If I had on a survey and I asked the question, how important is affordable health care and quality of education to you? You give me an answer and you say that it's very important. How do I know if you're responding to the part about affordable health care or if you're responding to the part about quality education? A double-barreled question asks two questions at one time, but you only get one answer. So you don't really know the respondent's true feelings to the question because you asked two questions at one time. It's better to take questions like that and divide them into two separate questions so that you can get an accurate measure of those attitudes and those beliefs and those behaviors. The next thing that is concerning is developing very ambiguous questions, questions that are not clear or well articulated. One way that we do this is to ask very big and vague questions. If I was interested in knowing about college students' class attendance, and I ask the question, did you attend class today? And I get the response, yes. Well, that may not be the best question to ask because I didn't really ask them if they attended all of their classes or if they attended their 8 a.m. class. I asked if they attended class. So if a student had 3 classes that day and they attended one of them, that being the class that's the latest in the day, I'm not really getting a full picture of what class attendance looks like for that student because I didn't ask a specific question. So you want to be as specific as possible so that you can get the full information, because if I walked away with just that answer, I would say, great, this student attends their classes, but I don't know that it means that they attend all of their classes. A next concern has to do with asking leading questions. So sometimes we develop questions without realizing it that have bias in them in the way that they're structured. So we ask somebody a question that leads them to give us a specific answer. An example of this would be if I ask, don't you think students should make class attendance a priority? Now, by me saying, don't you think students should make class attendance a priority, I'm kind of leading my respondents in a certain direction so that they can agree with me. And this leads to agreement bias, where they'll be like, yes, I absolutely think that students should make class attendance a priority. But a better way to structure that question, instead of leading them toward a specific answer, is to ask them, how important is class attendance to student success? Or how big of a priority do you think class attendance should be to students or is to students? That way I'm not leading them in a specific direction, but just trying to get their true feelings on the topic of class attendance. Another issue that affects questions and question wording has to do with having one-sided questions versus two-sided questions. A one-sided question only lays out one position, and again, it leads to response bias. But a two-sided question lays out both positions within the question and gives the respondent an opportunity to go through and pick which side they want to land on. So an example of a one-sided question, let's think about abortion and the topic of abortion legislation in the United States. A one-sided question would ask, do you agree that women should have the ability to decide whether or not they should have a child? That would be a one-sided question. Now, for a specific group of people, that may very well be exactly how they feel. But to the average respondent, if they hear that question, they may decide to answer in a way that goes in the direction of the question just out of agreement bias, which is a concern with surveys. Instead of having that one-sided way of asking that question, a better approach would be to ask, do you think a woman should have a right to choose whether or not to carry a child when pregnant? Or do you think life begins at conception and from that point decisions have to be made about a child after it's born? So by positioning and stating the question that way, I give the respondent an opportunity to sit on either side of the issue instead of presenting them with just one side of the issue. When you use one side of the issue, then you place yourself in a position for agreement bias. Now, one major benefit of using survey questions and designing and developing survey questions is that you can recycle questions from other sources, from existing surveys, and include them in your own survey. Or you can also recycle the data that you collect here and use it in a different study if you have multiple questions that you're asking about. So that those are two major advantages of taking this approach. And when it comes to different types of survey questions, there are only really two categories of survey questions. You have open-ended questions and you have closed-ended questions. So an open-ended question is a question that has fixed responses already outlined for you. And you'll see this when you have questions where your answer choices are yes or no, or it could be something like select your gender and you have to pick female or male. It doesn't just have to be dichotomous though. It could be 3 or 4 different categories. Select your race and it could have African American, white, Asian, Native American, but it's still a fixed choice because you only have the options to pick from what the researcher has outlaid as possible answers to the question. Another way of having a closed-ended question would be when you have the strongly disagree to strongly agree scale where you have to pick where you want to land on it. And it's only giving you those fixed options to choose from. But then you have open-ended questions, and this is where you have more of a free and unstructured response. And they stay there. You largely see those with like questions where it says things like, "How do you feel about XYZ?" question mark, and then you're left with a blank where you can fill in how you feel about that specific thing. Or it says something like, describe your experiences with this thing, period, and you're left with that blank to fill in that information. Using those type of questions puts you in a situation to where you would gain more depth of information from the respondent by allowing them to have just free reign in the way that they respond to the question. So what are some advantages of both open-ended and closed-ended questions? Well, a first advantage of closed-ended questions is that it takes less time to answer. You only have 2, 3, 4, or 5 things to pick from in each question, so you pretty much know where you will land, and you can pretty much go through that survey in a quick amount of time. The next thing is that it allows you to pre-code your answers, and that's something that you use on the data analysis side of it. If you only had categories of yes and no or A or B, then you can go through and already set that up in your spreadsheet, and then from there you can just simply input those codes for those different answers. Another thing is that it simplifies comparison. If there are only a few things to choose from, then that means that there are only a few things to compare. And the last thing is that it avoids misinterpretation of questions. If you have fixed answers already outlined, then it's harder to misinterpret that question because you only have a few things, again, that you can select from. So you have to choose the answer which best matches your true feelings. But there are also a number of advantages to open-ended questions. For one, it allows the respondent to state what they actually know. If you have closed-ended responses and it includes things that the respondent isn't really familiar with, you're forcing them to pick something that they don't really have information on. The next thing is that in addition to not forcing them to make choices or forcing them to answer questions that they don't really know a whole lot about, you allow the respondent to be able to define their answers to the questions. So you may have already made up in your mind that the answer has to be yes or no or A, B, or C when you structure a closed-ended question. But if you leave it open-ended, you may not see A, B, or C listed as the answer to the question from the respondent. It may be X. So that's something to consider there. If you only give them A, B, and C as a choice, that means you're only get data on A, B, and C. But when you use the open-ended response, you can also get information on X, Y, Z, and Q, and all of those good things. The final thing is that it allows respondents to surprise the researcher. You may find that there is something that the respondents pull out or discuss that you never even thought was related to the thing that you're interested in understanding. I know I found that in my own research that respondents can provide me with more information than I thought from the beginning. They bring up different ideas and they generate different things, and you're just surprised by the things that they say, and it makes you realize that the issue may look a little bit differently than you originally thought it looked, or it may include things that you had not considered in the beginning. But there are some other concerns that we need to note when it comes to the order in which we ask questions, because the order that you ask questions also plays a big part in surveys and survey design. So what you don't want to experience is response set bias. And response set bias simply refers to if you ask a lot of questions that all have the same answer options, then you're likely to put people in a rhythm of responding to those answer options in a pattern rather than their true feelings. I'll give you all an example. If you give somebody a survey that has strongly agree to strongly disagree all the way down the survey, there's a good chance that they will go down the survey and say agree, 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 agree to everything, or neutral to everything, because they know the question pattern. A good way to address that would be to state your questions in a way to where they can't necessarily just agree to everything and be reporting their true feelings. If you state all of your questions in a positive sense, in a way that affirms agree in every single question, then that's likely to happen. But if you reverse the way that you state your questions, then you're more likely to make them think about it instead of just going through the pattern of agree, agree, agree. I'll give you guys an example. If you're interested in political ideology and you're doing a survey on like liberalism, and you're measuring somebody's level of liberalism, you ask a question about whether or not you think there should be increased government spending on something like welfare. And then the next question you ask, you say it is something like, do you agree that there should not be increased spending on government welfare? So now you've asked the question in different ways, but you're still getting at the same thing. So on the first one, they may have said strongly agree. But when they read the second question, they know that if they are somebody of a liberal leaning, then chances are they wouldn't put strongly agree to that same thing. So that keeps them out of that pattern of going through and saying agree, 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 agree. Instead, they actually have to go through, think about, and read the questions thoroughly. Another issue that comes up in the way that we structure our questions and have the order that we have the questions in has to do with salience. Salience simply refers to mentioning something earlier in a survey and then the respondent bringing it back up in their answer further down in the survey because we triggered that thing in their mind. So if you're asking somebody a question about the opioid crisis, right? Asking them their opinions on the opioid crisis and all of that stuff. And then you ask them a question further down and you ask what should be a major topic of discussion in the next presidential debate. And then they say, well, I think it should be the opioid crisis. I think that's something that we should definitely talk about, because your previous question triggered them higher up in the survey to think about opioids. Then they start to respond this talking about opioids and the importance of opioids in questions further down the line. Another thing that happens is question redundancy. Sometimes respondents can be extremely consistent and they want to be extremely consistent in the way that they respond to your survey. So they will start to repeat their answers to previous questions on new questions if they're similar even in the slightest bit. If you're asking questions about things that are supposed to be important in the United States, and then you'd ask another question on what do you think should be some of the focuses internationally? What's something that should be important in the United States? I think we need to make sure we have a strong defense. And then you ask another question about some things that we should be concerned about as far as like international affairs. I think we need to make sure that we have a strong military presence internationally. And then you ask a question about what do you think is the best solution or the best way to address the issue with COVID-19. And then they go on and they say, I think having a stronger military presence in these different localities will really improve the situation. So they may become really redundant in their responses to different questions, giving you similar responses going down, and you notice that pattern there. A final thing that happens, and something that you really don't want to happen, but it can, depending on what you're asking in your survey, I've experienced it personally with my own research, is fatigue. This is when respondents start to give you effortless responses to your survey questions, and it usually happens when your survey is lengthy. And we try our very best for this reason to make our surveys as short as possible. We want them to be pithy because we want to be respectful of people's time as well as respectful of their attention spans. So we try to make sure that we ask questions that, create surveys that are shorter rather than longer. Because when a survey gets long, then you may start to see people, and you may have experienced this yourself, where you get down to around question 20, and then you just start responding effortlessly. You just start checking boxes or hitting bubbles and not really thinking about it. And that way you're providing the researcher with inaccurate information just because you're tired. So those are all things to consider when you're talking about the way that your questions are ordered and the way that your questionnaire, your survey is structured. So within your survey, there are two ways to go about sorting out the people who respond to your survey. One way is by branching, and the other way is by filtering. Two sides of the same coin. It just depends on what you're interested in attaining from the process. So the branching, you decide the appropriate question set for the respondent. You may have multiple question sets depending on the area of interest that you have, and so you ask them a question to kind of prime them and to see which group you should put them in. I'll give you an example. If you're giving a survey to lawyers and you have different question sets depending upon the type of law that they practice that you would ask them questions about, then one way to create a branching question is to start at the very beginning of the survey and asking them, what type of law do you practice? The respondent selects criminal law, and then that branches out and sends them in the direction of like all of the criminal law questions. If they, instead of selecting criminal law, they selected child advocacy law, then that would branch out and give them a totally different set of questions specific to child advocacy law. So that's how a branching question works. And then you have filter questions. And with filter questions, you use this to decide whether or not a respondent should be given a portion or the entire survey. One way that I use this, or we use in my research, is that I'm surveying social workers. So one way to filter out who should and should not be taking this survey is to make one of the first questions, if not the very first question, are you a social worker? If they respond yes, then they go through and then they're taken to the rest of the questions in the survey. If they respond no, then the next screen they see says, thank you for submitting your responses to this survey. And they aren't giving any more questions, because if I'm only interested in data on social workers, I want to make sure I know that this person is or isn't a social worker, so that it tells me how to move forward with getting them out of the whole process and who to move forward with. So now let's talk a little bit about our different administration methods. When it comes to surveys, there are a number of ways to administer them, a number of different types that you should consider. You can have phone surveys, you can have mail surveys, whether that be snail mail or email. You can have face-to-face surveys as well. But with each of these types of surveys, there comes a number of trade-offs that you have to consider. The sample population congruency, the response rate. You need to consider the cost, as well as the cost of the data collection. So first I'll start with the sample congruency. Sample congruency refers to how well the people who take your survey match or represent the population that you're interested in studying. So if you're distributing a survey and it gets into the hands of individuals who don't really match the target population, like for me, I was interested in social workers. If my survey for some reason goes to a lot of lawyers instead of going to a lot of social workers, because of the method that I use, and let's say I decide to place it on a lot of professional boards, and for some reason on professional announcement boards, lawyers are looking at these boards more often than anybody else, and they go through and they click on these things, then I'll end up with a sample that is incongruent to the population I'm interested in surveying. Another way of thinking about this, even within the realm of social work, would be if, for instance, I decide to distribute my survey to the Association for Licensed Social Workers. And then I distributed to that association, but I find out that since I decided to use that method, it also went to people who are not social workers. So that means that the sample that I use may not be completely congruent with the population that I'm interested in studying. But all of those things and all of those trade-offs, they're outlined in your book in a beautiful little chart that shows you what those trade-offs look like for each type that you use. So with the face-to-face, the telephone, the snail mail, regular mail surveys, the trade-offs that you have there. Another consideration as far as the trade-off is concerned is the response rate. The response rate is the rate of people who respond to your survey compared to the number of people who you actually distributed the survey to. So how many people responded in comparison to how many people were given the survey. And response rate can be largely affected by the way that you choose to administer your survey, the same way as sample congruency. If I decide to administer my survey via phone, my response rate may look vastly different than if I decide to distribute my survey by coming face to face and knocking on doors individually. Chances are, if I did face to face, I may have a higher response rate than if I just cold called a lot of people. So that's something to consider there. Another consideration is cost. Some methods of distributing a survey are way more expensive than others. If you want to do paper surveys, that's something that can be very expensive because you have to have an envelope, sheet of paper, and a stamp postage for each individual survey that you send out if you decide to do it that way. Whereas if you decide to do it over the internet, all you have to do is have some source to distribute your survey, and then it goes into individual email accounts and boxes there, and you have a way lower cost of distribution. Another way that it affects cost is in the whole data processing portion of it. If you decide to do a paper survey, you have to transfer all of that paper data into an electric format in order to do any sort of statistical analysis. And that is something that can be very costly depending on the data system that you're needing to use to do that. But there are a number of benefits to using the most commonly administration way currently, which is internet surveys. That's something that we're all familiar with, and we get more of those than anything else. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of that. It tends to be very fast. It tends to be something that's easily accessible to a lot of people, and people tend to be willing to use that as a form of collecting information. A lot of people are okay with using that. But there are some issues with using the internet as a survey administration tool. One is we don't really think about this, but believe it or not, a lot of people don't have access to the internet. So if we only distribute our survey via internet, there are certain groups of people that are left out of the process. One would be elderly people, because elderly people typically don't have internet access or don't use the internet as often. Another group of people that tend to be left out are the poor. A lot of poor people don't have access to internet unless they go to like a public library or something like that. And another group that's often left out is the lower educated individuals, who typically don't interact with those interfaces at the same rate as somebody who may be like, highly educated. Another issue that comes up with using using internet surveys is that you're not able to get access to contact lists in the same way that you're able to get access to contact lists if you're using phone or mail, because you can get access to phone numbers easily a lot of the times, and then you can just call those different phone numbers in order to generate respondents to your survey. And you can also get access to addresses, and just mail them out. But getting access to people's personal email accounts tends to be a little tricky a lot of times. So then you don't have that same like contact list that you would normally get, and you have to depend upon people to release that information to you in order to participate in your study, and that can be something that's difficult to get access to. So with that being said, a lot of experts recommend using a hybrid method of doing surveys, which would be to either use multiple forms like using phone, mail, and internet, or on the front end, deciding to reach out via phone or via mail and then requesting that they go to the internet to complete the actual survey so that you'll have all the data online. All considerations to make there. So the final thing we want to talk about is data management. There are a number of different steps that you go through in order to manage your data. Now you either got your source, you either got existing survey data or you collected your own survey data. But once you get to the point where you have data, we're pretty much on the same page about going about managing our data. The first thing that you have to do is you have to find sources. If you're not collecting your own data, and as I stated earlier, there are a number of places that you can get data from. ICPSR, General Social Survey, Roper. You can use the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can also use the Federal Elections Commission to get data from. Those are a lot of different sources, and that's just a few of them. You can use the census, a lot of different places. The next thing that you have to do once you have gotten your sources is to learn everything that you can about your data. You need to make sure that you know the who, the what, and the when if you're using existing data. You need to know who collected the data, hopefully a university or some scholarly institution. You need to know what exactly they collected it, how they operationalize these variables that they're using is very important because you never know. They could be defining one thing as something in their study and you're calling it something totally different in your study. You need to know when this took place and you need to know exactly how they collected their data. These are all very important things that you need to make sure that you know when using existing data. The next thing that you need to consider or to think about that helps you understand the who, the what, the when, and all that type of stuff for your data is the availability of code books. So a code book is something that's developed for a data set that explains exactly the different components, what's included in the data set, and how they came to those different conclusions, and how they coded all those different variables, as well as how they measured them. So you found the data. You now have collected the data. That means that you downloaded the data set and you're going through, you're learning everything about the data that you possibly can. And now it's time to kind of like play with the data. And you can do that by downloading the data. And usually when you download data, you can download it in a number of different versions. If you ever look at one of these data sources that I've outlined, they give you the option of like a text file, an Excel file, as well as some statistical analysis packages such as SPSS, Stata, R, SAS, and all of those different things that you can use to download the data set in so that you'll be able to go through and analyze it. If you're using primary data, then you have to go through, you have to record it, and then you have to set up these spreadsheets and develop them for yourself. So if you're using a secondary source, you're going to download a actual data set in a spreadsheet that's been compiled for you. But if you're using a primary source, then you have to create that spreadsheet, that data source for yourself. And when you're doing this and you're going through the process of setting up this data source for yourself through a spreadsheet, you need to record the data. And you need to mostly record in the rows and the columns. And if you guys have ever used Excel, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with what this looks like. So you go through on each row, and each row is an observation. It represents a respondent and what they said, and all the different columns represent the different variables. And you need to make sure that you put names in all of these spots so that you know what everything represents and you're keeping excellent notes on what each variable is. I know I am a stickler all the time for telling you guys to be super specific on things, but this is why. Because specificity is a part of the game when we're talking about research methods. You have to be very specific because people have to be able to come behind you and to be able to go through and conduct your study again if needed. So you have to keep great notes there. Now, after you develop this data set for yourself, one thing that you want to make sure you do is that you create a data file as well as a backup file. I know that we are in an age now to where everything is in the cloud, and I get that. But I'm a little bit old school, and I think you should be as well when it comes to data. Not only should you have the cloud, but you should probably have like a thumb drive somewhere. And you need to also make sure that you have like a copy on your desktop or something because crazy things happen. And if you depend on the cloud and then one day it's missing from the cloud and that's all that you use, then you put you in a very negative situation where you no longer have your data and you have to create everything from scratch again. So make sure that you have a backup. And then you have to consistently make sure that you are able to manage the data. There are a number of different features, and I won't go into too much detail here about the different features that you can use in the different data management and the statistical analysis packages in order to go through and do different things with the data. But I will say in general, there are options that allow you to sort the data by the variable so that you can look at just the specific variable. Some that allow you to create new variables out of what you already have, so you can create something totally new, where you can go through and delete cases. But I would be very careful and very weary of doing that, because once you delete things, it's hard to get them back. It's better to just go through and create a different file, a separate file with only things that you want to be in there. But deleting cases is a way to go through and clear up and get rid of clutter. And it's a way to select cases on the variable, meaning select out only the cases that meet very specific criteria, and you can only look at those cases. So those are some of the basic commands for data management that you can see within like a data analysis package and when you're setting up your own data with your surveys. The final thing I want to talk about briefly is the ethical concerns of quantitative methods. Um, a lot of times we don't realize this, but every statistic that you read isn't a full portrayal of the truth. And we want to make sure that we portray the truth as much as possible in our research, because we want to be good ethical scholars and researchers. You have to understand that statistics can be falsified. People can go through and they can manipulate things, and they can present information in a way that is very misleading. But that is not our objective in scientific research and using the scientific method. One of the central tenets of the scientific method is to make sure that you are being as objective as possible and reporting accurate information. So, I'm a major stickler for making sure that you don't use the word prove, making sure that you don't talk about proving anything. And this is one of the major reasons why I'm concerned with using that word. Because if you are focused on proving something, that means that you're putting yourself in a position to be more likely to tweak and adjust data in order to support your assertions. And that is not what we do as scientific researchers. We don't try to find things that support our assertions. We don't try to manipulate or falsify data in order to support our assertions. Instead, we want to take an objective look and interpret what's already there. Okay, we want to make sure that we provide correct interpretations and provide the full story of the data without leaving things out to mislead people to see things in very specific ways. So we want to make sure that we're being ethical in the way that we collect data and we use data. So that pretty much sums up everything for chapter 10, talking about the different quantitative methods, and we'll get more in detail with the statistical stuff. The statistical stuff in the later chapters in the book. But these are just some things for you to consider, and things that I think you will find very beneficial in your own research and developing your research design. I'm pretty sure that the majority of you guys are going to use either content analysis or some sort of survey design for your studies. So this has outlined what that process should look like for you, and in your explanation to me of what you plan to do in your study. So that is all for this chapter, and we'll discuss chapter 11 next.